If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. Winter 1944. The farming village of St. Celine lay nearly silent under a layer of uneven snow. Most of the houses were cracked open from previous shelling, their roofs sagging under the weight of ice. Doors hung from shattered hinges, exposing interiors stripped by fear and hurried evacuations. Smoke drifted from only two remaining chimneys, weak and thin, as if whoever lived inside burned the last pieces of furniture just to keep the cold away. Mary Ann Lenore stood beside what used to be her family's barn, watching her breath rise in faint clouds. She kept her coat wrapped tight around her, one hand gripping the fabric near her collar. She had slept only a few hours in the last 2 days, resting on a straw pile while listening to distant gunfire and waiting for the next shell to land. Her eyes were red and dry, but her movements remained controlled. She checked the barn door, checked the latch on the chicken coop, and then scanned the road for any sign of incoming soldiers. She stayed in the village because it was the last piece of her old life. Her husband had died during an air raid the year before. She had lived through that disaster, pulled from rubble by neighbors, and she refused to repeat the experience of running and losing everything again. This farm was all she had left. Even alone, even exhausted, she would guard it. Across the snowy fields, the crunch of boots signaled the arrival of Allied scouts. A small reconnaissance team moved cautiously between broken walls and frozen tree stumps, rifles held tight, eyes scanning rooftops. Their breath showed in the cold air as they spread out, taking positions behind stone fences and carts. They had been sent from an advancing American division to confirm whether the Germans had retreated or set up another delaying line around the village. Elias Ward walked at the rear of the group, quiet and steady. He was in his late 20s, taller than the others, with a tired expression that suggested he carried more memories than he ever wanted. Before the war, he had grown up on a small ranch in Kansas, learning to shoot by hunting coyotes and deer. He lost his younger brother in North Africa during the first months of the campaign, and that moment had changed him. Since then, he rarely spoke unless necessary, and when he did, his voice remained calm and even. As a marksman, his purpose here was simple: locate hidden threats before they could kill his team or the civilians who remained. His mission in St. Celine was to confirm the village was safe for the approaching Allied units and to neutralize any remaining enemy resistance. But the last 2 days had shown that the village was not empty. A German sniper had pinned down another scout group earlier, killing 2 men before they could even identify where the shot came from. Elias had been sent in because the situation demanded someone patient and precise. He examined the buildings one by one, noting broken windows that created dangerous lines of sight, roof holes that allowed a rifle barrel to hide, and shadowed attic spaces where a sharpshooter could lie still for hours. His mind worked quietly. Angle of attack, elevation, possible retreat paths, locations with clear views of key streets. The fact that they had lost men already meant the sniper was skilled, someone who fired only when he had a guaranteed hit. Marion noticed the soldiers moving through the village and stepped closer, staying in the cover of the barn wall. She did not know these men, but she understood the danger well. For days, villagers who tried to run for supplies or water had been struck down the moment they entered the open. She watched Elias with careful eyes, seeing how he studied every detail around him with slow, measured movements. One of the scouts attempted to cross from a stable to a blown-out bakery across the street. He sprinted low, boots cutting into the snow. Marion held her breath. Elias raised his hand slightly in warning, but the man was already halfway across. A single gunshot cracked through the cold. The scout collapsed instantly, sliding forward on the snow until his body stopped near a broken barrel. Blood spread quickly across the white ground. Another scout shouted and dropped to his knees behind cart. A second bullet smashed into the stone beside him, spraying fragments across his coat. Panic jolted through the group as they scrambled for cover. Elias stayed low behind a wall, his rifle pressed to his chest. He scanned rooftops with narrowed eyes, trying to capture the faint light of a muzzle flash or the disturbance of smoke. But he saw nothing. The shot had come from somewhere high, somewhere concealed, somewhere chosen with intention. Marion backed deeper against the barn wall, her heart pounding. She felt the familiar grip of fear tighten across her ribs. Not the kind that made her freeze, but the kind that sharpened every sense. She knew this village better than anyone left alive. She knew how sound traveled between these buildings, how wind shifted around the rooftops, how certain walls created strange echoes. But she had never been under fire like this. Her hands trembled slightly, and she forced them still. Elias felt frustration rising under his steady expression. He had seen too many ambushes, too many civilians die, because soldiers could not see the threat in time. He forced himself to breathe slowly, fighting the instinct to rush into the open and drag the fallen scout back. He knew that would only add another body to the snow. The remaining scouts whispered urgently over the distance, discussing angles and possible enemy hideouts. But every idea hit the same problem. The sniper had chosen a position impossible to detect with normal tactics. Marianne stepped forward from the barn doorway, her boots crunching softly in the snow. Elias turned his head just enough to notice her movement. She hesitated, thinking through the danger, thinking through the responsibility. Fear pressed against her ribs again, but she pushed it aside. These soldiers were the only barrier between her home and total destruction. She walked closer, staying low, and Elias met her eyes. He saw in her expression something he recognized, grief that had hardened into resilience. She saw in his expression a man who had carried too many ghosts. The chapter closes with the two of them facing the same threat, a single hidden rifle that controlled the entire village. The scouts pinned down, a dead man in the snow, a sniper no one could locate. Marion stood there, breathing hard, knowing she could help, and knowing it might cost her life. Elias watched her carefully, aware that the next decision he made might determine whether more people lived or died. The danger was clear, and neither of them intended to run. Snow drifted across the empty street as Marianne stopped a few paces from the American scout team. Elias kept his back against the stone wall, watching her move with a careful, deliberate pace. The others, tense, shaken, still rattled by the scout's death, shifted aside to give her space. No one spoke at first. The cold settled between them like a hard weight. Elias lowered his rifle slightly, signaling that she could approach. Marianne looked at the wounded man lying in the street, his body already half covered by falling snow. She swallowed, then turned her focus to the soldiers. "You can't stay out there," she said quietly, her voice hoarse from days without proper rest. "He sees everything." One of the younger scouts muttered under his breath, "We know that much." His frustration hung in the air, raw and honest. Elias shot him a warning glance before stepping toward Marianne. "You came to tell us something," he said. His tone was calm, steady, inviting her to continue. Marianne hesitated, gathering the thoughts she had been holding back. She knew they needed more than fear and speculation. They needed information. She also sensed their unspoken questions. Why hasn't this sniper moved? How long has he been here? Where can he see from? And the most important one, why hasn't anyone been able to locate him? "I've lived in this village all my life," she said, letting her breath steady. "If he's been firing for days, he's not changing positions. He must have a place with cover, height, and a clear view of the main streets. Somewhere he can hide without freezing." Her eyes drifted over the rooftops, studying them with the familiarity of someone who had played here as a child and worked here as an adult. The scouts exchanged glances. This was the first real lead they'd heard. Elias motioned for them to move inside a half-collapsed farmhouse so they could talk without being exposed. The group shifted through the doorway, stepping around shattered bricks, overturned furniture, and a fallen beam that blocked half the room. The flickering light from a single oil lamp cast long shadows on the walls. Marianne followed, brushing snow off her coat sleeves. Inside, she felt a quiet tension gathering. These men were armed and experienced, but they were cornered. They needed a strategy that their training didn't cover. and she needed them alive if she hoped to keep her farm and the last piece of her life intact. Elias knelt beside a cracked wooden table. "Tell us what you know," he said. Marion exhaled slowly. "Your men have been asking the wrong question. They've tried to find where he's hiding. But you should be asking how sound travels through this village." Elias's expression sharpened. The scouts leaned in. She continued, "Some buildings here carry echoes. Some swallow sound completely. When I was young, my father taught me how to tell which roof he was working on just from the way his hammering bounced off the walls. And when the wind blew a certain way, you could hear a man walking across the market square, even from the fields." The men listened closely. None of them had this knowledge. None of them could understand the acoustic quirks of a centuries-old stone village. Elias straightened slightly. "You're saying we can use sound to flush him out?" "Yes," Marianne said, "but not with gunfire or shouting. That won't carry right anymore with the damage to the buildings." She stepped toward a cluttered corner where old farm tools were piled. Among them, half buried under a bent rake, was a metal milk pail dented from years of use. She lifted it, feeling its weight. "This will carry sound. If I walk through the village and strike at certain points, he'll have to adjust his aim. The echo will reveal the direction he's watching." The room went silent. One of the scouts shook his head sharply. "That's suicide." Marion met his eyes. "If I stay in cover at the right places and move with someone watching over me, I'll be safer than you think." Elias stood up slowly, his jaw tightening. "Not safe enough." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I can't let a civilian walk into that kind of danger." "You already lost men," Marianne said, her tone steady. She refused to look away. "And he won't stop unless someone forces him to reveal himself." Her words carried exhaustion, pain, and a kind of stubborn courage Elias understood too well. She had the look of someone who had already lost everything once and refused to flee again. And Elias felt something shift inside him, a pressure he recognized from earlier battles, the fear of failing another innocent person. He asked, "Why stay here? You could have left like the others." "This is my home," she said simply. "It's all I have left. If I abandon it now, I lose the last part of the life I built with my husband." Her honesty cut through the room. The scouts lowered their eyes. Her grief wasn't dramatic. It was the kind that settled deep into a person and anchored them in place. Elias rubbed a hand over his face, thinking through the angles. Marianne's idea made tactical sense. She knew sound patterns. She knew blind spots. She knew the village better than any map could show. And he knew if they waited, the sniper would kill again. "All right," he said finally, "but we do this on my terms. You don't move unless I tell you. You stay behind cover whenever possible. And I follow so close that if he fires, I can see exactly where it's coming from." Marion nodded once, accepting. "I understand." Elias exhaled, feeling the weight of the decision settle in his chest. He wasn't only responsible for stopping the sniper. Now he was responsible for keeping her alive. The other scouts gathered around the cracked table while Elias sketched a rough outline of the village, marking paths, blind corners, surviving walls, and areas where the sniper had fired before. Marianne leaned over the table, adding small corrections. An old chimney gap here, a collapsed balcony there, a courtyard wall that carried echoes farther than it should. Together, they shaped a route that would force the sniper to react without giving him a clean shot. Outside, the wind picked up. Snow drifted through broken window frames, settling on the floor. The village remained silent except for the distant groan of shifting beams. When the plan was finalized, Elias stepped back and studied Marianne. Her hands were steady now. Her eyes held a clear, determined focus. He felt a flicker of something: respect, worry, and a quiet recognition of her strength. She wasn't reckless. She was simply done running. "When do we start?" she asked. Elias checked his rifle, chambered around, and nodded slowly. "Now," he said. They stepped into the cold, preparing to walk into a village ruled by a single, unseen gun. Their fragile alliance, unspoken but real, was all they had against a threat neither could face alone. And the hunt for the sniper began. The wind cut through the village as Elias and Marianne stepped out of the ruined farmhouse, the metal milk pail hanging from her hand. Snow fell in thin, uneven flakes, drifting across rooftops and sticking to the broken stone. The scouts spread out to their assigned positions, each man keeping low, rifles braced against window frames and shattered walls. Everyone knew the risk. A single mistake could bring another shot from the hidden German marksman. Elias guided Marianne to the edge of the first courtyard. He kept close, never more than a single arm's reach behind her, moving with controlled precision. His breathing steadied. His thoughts narrowed into the simple rhythm that kept him alive in every engagement. Measure distance, mark angles, anticipate danger, protect whoever stands beside you. Marianne tightened her grip on the milk pail. She felt the cold metal bite through her gloves. Despite the fear tightening in her stomach, she felt strangely focused. Elias's presence behind her grounded her. His steady movements and calm voice made her feel less alone in the empty village. "Only when I signal," he murmured, keeping his eyes on every rooftop, every shadowed ledge. She nodded once, inhaled the icy air, and stepped into the open part of the courtyard. Her footsteps crunched softly in the snow. Elias slid behind a pile of broken firewood, rifle ready, watching her silhouette against the pale light. She lifted the rock and struck the side of the pail. The metal rang sharply, clean, unnatural, echoing across the narrow street. The sound bounced between walls, traveling in uneven pulses. Marianne waited, heart pounding, scanning the upper windows even though she knew she wouldn't see the sniper. Elias listened, analyzing the echo pattern she mentioned. Certain walls returned sound more sharply than others. Certain corners swallowed noise completely. It helped him narrow down possible angles. No shot came on the first strike. Marianne moved to the next marked spot, a few steps ahead where a collapsed balcony created a deep shadow on the wall. She struck again, harder this time. The clang cut through the frozen air. The sniper answered. A single rifle shot cracked from somewhere high, the bullet tearing into the courtyard wall, so close to Marianne that dust and stone splinters sprayed across her coat. She flinched, instinctively lowering herself. Elias reacted instantly, pulling her back behind the stone column beside him. "Don't freeze," he whispered, firm but steady. "You're all right." She breathed sharply, forcing herself to regain control. She wasn't used to this kind of danger, but she refused to fold. Her fear was real, but didn't scatter her thoughts. Instead, it sharpened everything. Her hearing, her sense of distance, her awareness of Elias's movements. Elias studied the bullet's impact line. The angle told him more than the scouts realized. "Higher than the bakery roof," he muttered under his breath, eyes tracking the distant structures. "Somewhere with a clear line down the street." They advanced again, moving through an alley that ran between a half-burned tailor shop and a stable. Marianne followed the route she had memorized, glancing at each building the way a farmer scans the sky before a storm. She knew every corner of this place, where the wind shifted, which roofs collapsed last winter, which walls cracked after the artillery strike 3 days earlier. She knew how sound behaved here, but now she also felt how the village itself had changed. Broken beams, missing rooftops, shattered chimneys. All of it altered the way noise carried. This was part of why the sniper had been impossible to detect. The battlefield wasn't stable anymore. At the edge of the alley, Marianne paused. Elias touched her arm lightly, his silent signal to wait. He scanned the rooftops again, especially the northern section of the village where several buildings still stood at full height. Another signal. Marianne stepped forward. She struck the pail again. This time, the sound bounced sharply off the far stone barns, creating a sharper echo than before. Elias heard it clearly. He leaned to the side, narrowing his eyes as he studied how the echo returned. Another rifle shot burst through the silence. The bullet sliced through a hanging sign above Marianne's head, sending wooden shards raining down. Elias pushed her toward a low stone trough, shielding her with his body as he listened to how quickly the gunshot rolled down the street. This time, the clues aligned more clearly. He exhaled, steady and focused. He's moving his aim from the north side, somewhere elevated, likely the barns. Marion steadied her breathing. She could sense the danger tightening around them. But she also sensed that Elias had begun to read the sniper's habits. Every shot added clarity. They moved deeper into the village, toward a narrow lane lined with old wine barrels and broken crates. Snow accumulated in uneven mounds here, shaped by the wind funneled through the tight passage. Marianne stepped carefully, striking the pail in short intervals, each clang more controlled than the last. She was finding a rhythm, listening to the echoes just as Elias did, adjusting her strikes so they rang cleaner. Another shot erupted from the distance. This one struck the ground near her boots, kicking snow into the air. Marion stumbled back as Elias grabbed her coat, pulling her into cover. The scouts in the distance responded immediately, searching for muzzle flash, movement, anything, but still the sniper remained unseen. Elias pressed a gloved hand against the wall, thinking through every detail. The pattern was too consistent. The sniper wasn't adjusting randomly. He was anchored to a fixed point with a limited field that still managed to cover multiple streets. That narrows it, Elias said under his breath. He's in an elevated position that survived the shelling. Marianne turned her head slightly toward him. The north barn and the old granary are the only buildings with intact lofts. He nodded. One of those. Maybe both collapsed inside, but the roofs still give height. They moved again, slow, precise, avoiding any predictable timing. Marianne struck the pail from a final mark point, this time near a ruined workshop with collapsed beams scattered across the ground. The shot that answered was immediate. The bullet hit the corner of a distant roof tile, high, angled, and exactly where Elias expected it might come from. He tracked the faint puff of dust and the angle of the crack through the cold air. "It's the north barn," Elias said quietly, certainty sharpening his voice. "Third loft gap from the left side." He has a clear view of everything. Marion breathed out, relief mixing with fear. They had found him, but getting close enough for a clean shot would be the hardest part. Elias looked at her, his expression steady but firm. "You did well. Better than most soldiers I've worked with." She nodded, her face tense but composed. "What happens now?" "We finish this," he said, "and we make sure he never fires at this village again." Both of them stood in the cold silence, snow drifting across their boots, the milk pail hanging quietly at Marianne's side. They had finally cornered the hidden rifleman, and in the distance, the barn waited, its collapsed roof concealing the man who had turned an entire village into a death trap. Elias and Marianne stood at the edge of the narrow lane, snow settling quietly around them as the echo of the last rifle shot faded into the cold air. The north barn loomed in the distance, dark, partially collapsed, and surrounded by drifts of wind-packed snow. Its loft windows were broken, the roof sagging under years of weather and recent shelling, but it still stood higher than most buildings in the village. From that height, the sniper would see everything. Elias signaled to the scouts, who shifted into new positions around the barn's perimeter. They spread out silently, taking cover behind stone walls, fences, and the burned skeleton of a cart. Each man knew the sniper could still fire at any moment. They kept low and moved with careful steps. Marianne steadied the pail in her hand. Her nerves were tight, but her breathing had settled into a steady rhythm. She understood now why the soldiers had been unable to locate the shooter. Broken rooftops and collapsed beams created pockets of shadow that concealed movement, and shifting sound patterns made direction unreliable. Only someone who grew up here could make sense of it all. Elias kept beside her, placing himself slightly ahead whenever they reached open ground. His focus had narrowed to the barn loft. He pictured the layout inside: a raised platform, broken boards, maybe old hay bales or farming equipment that the sniper used for cover. He needed a clear angle, a clean shot that wouldn't endanger Marianne or any of the scouts. They approached from the side path where the bakery ruins created a partial shield. Elias raised his hand, signaling Marianne to stop. He studied the barn again, searching for movement, a silhouette, even a flicker of breath against the cold air. "Nothing. We stay low," he whispered. "We go slow." He's expecting panic, not a methodical approach. Marianne nodded. Her heart pounded with a mix of fear and determination. She had already risked her life walking through the streets. She wasn't turning back now. Elias pointed to a dip in the ground leading toward the barn's western wall. "We'll use that. Move only when I'm ready." They crouched and advanced in short, precise bursts. Snow brushed against Marianne's knees as she moved, her boots sinking into the cold, powdery ground. Elias checked every gap in the barn structure. He scanned the loft windows for small details: scuffed wood, disturbed snow, a faint shift of shadow. He sensed the direction of the sniper more clearly now, even without a shot. Experienced enemy marksmen rarely change positions once they found a vantage point that offered control. About 10 meters from the barn, Elias stopped again. "This is the last time we need the pail," he said quietly. One more sound, just enough to draw his attention for a second. Marianne's fingers tightened around the handle. She didn't speak, but her eyes held a steady resolve. Elias positioned himself behind a half-collapsed stone trough. It gave him a direct line toward the loft gap he suspected. He rested the rifle on the stone ledge, adjusted the sight, and waited. "When I tell you," he said. Marianne stood just within a narrow wedge of cover. She could feel the sniper's unseen eyes searching, measuring, waiting for them to slip. A cold shiver ran across her shoulders, but she exhaled to steady herself. Elias gave a short nod. Marianne stepped out just far enough for the sound to carry and struck the pail. The metal rang sharply, echoing between the barn walls and the nearby houses. The sniper fired instantly. The shot cracked through the air, hitting the edge of the stone wall beside Marianne and exploding into dust and debris. She flinched and ducked back, breath catching in her throat. Elias didn't move an inch, his eyes locked on the loft shadow. He saw it, a faint flash of metal, a slight recoil of a rifle barrel, a shift of weight behind a splintered wooden beam. "There," Elias murmured, steadying his aim. "Top right gap." He exhaled slowly, shoulders tightening with focus. He waited for the sniper to adjust again, a small movement, barely visible, but enough for a precise shot. Marianne stayed behind the wall, gripping the pail tightly, feeling her heartbeat thundering in her ears. She trusted Elias now, not blindly, but because he hadn't hesitated when protecting her. Another faint movement in the loft. Elias squeezed the trigger. The shot cut through the stillness. A dull thud echoed from inside the barn loft. Silence followed, deep, heavy, complete. The scouts moved immediately, spreading toward the barn in coordinated formation. Elias rose from behind the trough and signaled Marianne to stay close behind him. They crossed the snowy yard, stepping over broken boards and frozen mud as they approached the wide barn doors. Inside, the air was cold and stale. Distant beams creaked softly in the wind. The scouts climbed the old ladder that led to the loft, one man going first while the others covered him from below. Elias followed up the ladder, scanning each corner with his rifle. In the far end of the loft, behind a pile of broken hay bales and a collapsed section of wall, the sniper lay motionless. His rifle rested beside him, half buried in straw. He had built a nest of old blankets and supplies, a place meant for long, patient waiting. Elias checked the weapon, the angle of the nest, the sight lines. Everything matched perfectly with the shots fired over the last days. The sniper had been here all along. Marianne stood at the base of the loft, her hands clasped tightly. When Elias descended the ladder, she searched his expression for confirmation. "It's over," he said. She let out a slow breath, her shoulders sagging from the weight she hadn't realized she carried. For the first time in days, the village felt still, not from fear but from relief. Outside, the scouts reported clear ground. Civilians began to emerge from hiding places. An old couple from a cellar, a young boy from behind a haystack, a woman from inside a storage shed. Their eyes reflected exhaustion and caution, but also the first signs of hope. Marianne stepped into the barnyard, watching the sky darken with approaching evening. Elias walked beside her, his expression calm but heavy with everything he had just done. She glanced at him, her voice quiet but sincere. "Thank you." Elias didn't respond at first. He simply looked at her, really looked at her, and nodded once in acknowledgement. He didn't need to speak. The gratitude in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. The danger that ruled the village for days had finally ended, and a new, quieter tension, one built on trust, shared risk, and unspoken understanding, settled between them as the snow continued to fall. The north barn stood silent behind them, its broken loft no longer hiding danger. Elias and Marianne stepped out into the open yard, where snow continued to drift in soft sheets across the uneven ground. The last light of afternoon pressed against the horizon, turning the sky into a muted blend of gray and pale gold. The village, once trapped under the sniper's gaze, felt still for the first time in days. Not empty, but breathing again. Scouts moved cautiously through the streets, checking each house, stable, and cellar. Their footfalls crunched over snow and scattered debris, forming a slow, methodical rhythm as they cleared the final corners of the village. When they found no additional threats, their posture shifted from rigid readiness to cautious relief. Marianne watched from beside a broken fence near her barn. Her hands were clasped together, not out of fear this time, but from the overwhelming release of tension she had carried since the first shot rang out days ago. She glanced at Elias, who stood a few steps away, sweeping the rooftops one last time. Even now, after the sniper was gone, he checked every angle, a habit born from months of surviving battlefields where safety was often an illusion. "You're still looking," Marianne said quietly. "Old habit," he answered without turning. His breath fogged in the cold as he scanned the last section of roof. Sometimes when you think it's over, it isn't. She understood. War had taught him caution. Loss had taught him fear of being too late. When he finally lowered his rifle, Marianne felt the weight inside her chest settle. She stepped closer, studying his strained expression. He was tired in a way she recognized. Tired from effort, but also from the responsibility he carried. He had protected her, trusted her idea, and taken the shot that saved them all. A cold breeze swept across the yard. Marianne wrapped her coat tighter and began walking toward the courtyard where the fallen Allied scout still lay beneath a blanket of snow. The others had covered the body earlier and prepared a shallow grave beside the stable wall. Elias followed her silently. The burial was simple. Four scouts stood around the grave while another lowered the body in carefully, using a spare jacket as a shroud. The wind carried the faint sound of shifting snow, and the air carried the sense of finality that followed every battlefield loss. Marianne watched with her hands folded in front of her, the sadness on her face subdued but present. Elias helped cover the body with earth. He didn't rush. He placed each handful of soil with care, as if returning something to the ground instead of burying a man taken too soon. He felt the familiar tightness in his chest, which came every time he faced another death he couldn't prevent, but this time it wasn't as sharp. He had saved others. Marianne had saved others. The village had been spared further loss. As the scouts finished, Marianne stepped forward. "No one deserves to be left in the open," she said softly. "Thank you for bringing him home." The men nodded, appreciating her words in a way they couldn't fully express. Once the burial was complete, the scouts regrouped to report to their commanding officer. With the sniper eliminated, St. Celine was officially secured. A small security detachment would remain to protect civilians and monitor any German patrols passing through the area. The rest would move to rejoin the main Allied line. When the officer approached Marianne, he offered evacuation. "We can take you out of here," he said. "There's shelter farther west. Food, heat. You don't have to stay in this place." Marianne looked around her farm. The patched barn, the leaning fences, the cracked windows, the snow-covered fields. It was damaged, but it was hers. It was the last piece of her old life still standing. She shook her head calmly. "I'll stay," she said. "I've already lost one home. I'm not losing this one too." The officer respected her choice. He turned to Elias and gave further instructions for the detachment, then walked off to prepare his men for departure. Elias stayed by Marianne's side. He didn't look at her immediately. He watched the road leading out of the village, the one the scouts would soon take. He had been told he could continue advancing with his unit, but he found himself hesitating. The thought of leaving her in this half-ruined village felt wrong. too familiar to moments in his past when he had walked away from people who needed him more than he realized. He turned to her finally. She met his gaze without uncertainty. She knew the question he wasn't saying. "You don't have to stay because of me," she said quietly. "I know," he replied, "but I want to." There was no romantic hesitation in his voice, no grand declaration, just a grounded, quiet truth. He had spent months drifting from town to town, battlefield to battlefield, never stopping long enough to feel connected to anything. Marion had stood her ground when others fled. She had trusted him with her life. That mattered more than he expected. The officer gave him permission to remain with the detachment. Elias accepted without hesitation. Later, as the last of the scouts marched out of the village, Marianne and Elias walked behind her barn to sit on the wooden steps that overlooked the quiet fields. The light was fading, but the sky was clear, and for the first time in days there were no rifle cracks, no distant explosions, only the sound of wind moving across the snow. Marianne leaned her shoulder gently against his arm, not out of weakness, but because the moment felt earned. Elias placed his hand over hers, warm and steady. He didn't speak. Neither did she. The silence between them had become something safe, something honest. In the distance, smoke rose from the few chimneys now lit again by villagers emerging from hiding. The village wasn't whole, but it was alive. And for the first time since the war had reached her doorstep, Marianne felt the fragile outline of a future. Elias stayed beside her, watching the last traces of daylight fade. He had found a reason to remain, a place where his presence meant more than a rifle, and a woman who understood the quiet parts of him he rarely let anyone see. The echoes of fear had finally faded, and in the cold stillness of St. Celine, something new began, steady, real, and unharmed by the war just beyond their quiet, snow-covered fields.